On March 16, 1911, in the quiet Bavarian town of Günzburg, a child came into the world and his parents named him Josef. This was not an unusual birth, not marked by any particular omen. He was born into comfort, into a family that had worked its way up to respectability and wealth. He would grow up where education was valued, where discipline was expected, and where the future seemed to promise nothing but continued prosperity and social advancement. He would eventually pursue medicine, driven by what appeared to be a genuine desire to understand the human body, to unlock its secrets. He would stand before his peers and swear the Hippocratic oath, that ancient promise. First, do no harm. He would earn not one but 2 doctoral degrees, publishing research, building a reputation as a serious scientist with a promising future ahead of him. And then something happened. Between the years 1943 and 1945, in a place that would come to symbolize the absolute depths of human cruelty, this same doctor would oversee medical procedures on over 1,500 pairs of twins. He would personally select thousands of human beings for death with a casual gesture. He would conduct experiments that violated every principle of medical ethics, that treated human beings as nothing more than laboratory specimens. Of those 1,500 pairs of twins who passed through his hands, fewer than 200 would survive to see liberation. This is not a story about a monster, because monsters are easy for us to comprehend. Monsters are born evil, we tell ourselves. When we call someone a monster, we create distance. We place them in a category so separate from ourselves that we never have to ask the uncomfortable questions about how an ordinary person might travel the path they traveled. But Josef Mengele was not born a monster. He was, by all accounts from those who knew him in his youth, a normal boy who grew into an ambitious, intelligent, disciplined young man. This is something far more terrifying than a simple monster story, because this is the story of transformation, of how a healer became the architect of systematic suffering, of how scientific curiosity transformed into cruelty dressed in the language of research. This is the story of how a man convinced himself that horror was progress, that suffering was necessary, that the screams of children were simply the unfortunate but unavoidable sounds of scientific advancement. Welcome to Forgotten Minds. Today, we dissect the psychology of Josef Mengele, the man history would come to know as the Angel of Death. Josef Mengele was not raised in poverty, was not subjected to abuse or neglect. He was born into privilege, into a family ascending the social ladder thanks to his father Karl's successful factory manufacturing agricultural equipment. The Mengele family was wealthy, respected, devout Catholics, regular church attendees. By all external measures, Joseph's early years were stable, secure, and promising. But stability is not the same as emotional warmth, and security is not equivalent to love. Karl Mengele was stern, distant, authoritarian. He was not cruel, but neither was he affectionate. He believed that children needed discipline more than embrace. In the Mengele household, success was expected as a baseline, not celebrated as an achievement. Affection was conditional, rationed out only when achievement reached truly exceptional levels. This kind of emotional climate creates a particular psychological pattern. Joseph learned early that his value as a human being was not inherent but conditional, dependent on his ability to achieve, to excel, to stand out. He learned to construct his identity not around who he was, but around what he accomplished. And this meant that his self-worth became hostage to external validation, to the constant need to prove that he was not just good, but exceptional. And he did achieve. Josef Mengele was a brilliant student, focused and disciplined, capable of sustained concentration. He excelled particularly in the sciences, showing an early aptitude for biology and a fascination with the mechanics of living things. But there was something else present in young Joseph that his teachers noticed. His curiosity was not ordinary, but obsessive, relentless, the kind that cannot let a question rest until it has been answered completely. One of his teachers wrote, "Joseph doesn't just want to know how things work. He wants to know why they exist at all. He is not satisfied with describing phenomena. He wants to understand their fundamental purpose and origin. This is the mark of a scientific mind, but curiosity without constraint. Curiosity that recognizes no boundaries. Curiosity that is willing to sacrifice anything in pursuit of answers. Builds something entirely different." In 1930, Josef Mengele enrolled at the University of Munich to pursue medicine and anthropology. This was not just any moment in German history to be entering university. Germany was still reeling from the catastrophic defeat of World War I, still humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, collapsing under economic disaster. The German people found themselves impoverished, divided, and increasingly desperate for someone to explain how this had happened, and how the nation could recover its former glory. Into this psychological vacuum stepped a variety of ideologies, and among these, taught not in beer halls but in the most prestigious universities, accepted not by thugs but by respected professors, was racial science. The idea that human beings could be categorized into distinct biological races with different inherent qualities, and that the fate of nations depended on maintaining racial purity. It is absolutely critical to understand that this was not fringe pseudoscience. Eugenics was mainstream academic discourse in the 1920s and 1930s, taught at Harvard and Stanford, at Cambridge and Oxford. But in Germany, eugenic thinking metastasized into something darker, merging with nationalism, anti-Semitism, and social Darwinism, creating a comprehensive worldview that divided humanity into a hierarchy of races. At Munich, Mengele studied under respected academics who specialized in racial typology and racial hygiene. Under their tutelage, he learned to see human beings as specimens to be measured and categorized, to view traits as expressions of underlying genetic quality, to believe that science had both the capability and the responsibility to guide human evolution. He absorbed the idea that some lives were simply more valuable than others, that society could not afford to let sentiment interfere with the hard biological truths that science was revealing. In 1935, Mengele completed his doctoral dissertation in anthropology, examining racial differences in jaw structure. 3 years later, he completed his medical degree with distinction. By any conventional measure, Josef Mengele, at age 27, was exactly what the German educational system was designed to produce. A brilliant, highly trained scientist and physician with 2 doctoral degrees. And then, in 1937, Josef Mengele joined the Nazi Party. The following year, he joined the SS. These were not passive decisions. The SS was selective, accepting only those who demonstrated ideological commitment to Nazi principles. The ideology did not corrupt him so much as it liberated him, giving him permission to pursue research without the constraints that ethical concerns would normally impose. He had questions about heredity, about twins, and suddenly he found himself in a system that told him those questions were not just legitimate, but important. That pursuing them was a contribution to the future of the German race. Let us pause and conduct a psychological analysis of what has formed in Josef Mengele by this point, before he ever sets foot in Auschwitz. We are looking at a 30-year-old man with a specific constellation of personality traits that, when combined with the right circumstances, create a psychological structure capable of systematic cruelty without apparent guilt. The first element is narcissistic achievement orientation, where self-worth is entirely dependent on external validation through exceptional accomplishment. Mengele's sense of who he is depends on his ability to achieve, to be recognized as brilliant by authority figures. This is not simply ambition, but something more fragile and dangerous. An identity that collapses without constant achievement. The second trait is an exceptional capacity for psychological compartmentalization, for separating different aspects of reality into distinct mental categories that do not communicate with each other. Mengele can separate his actions from their consequences so completely that the suffering he causes exists in an entirely different mental category from his scientific goals. He can conduct procedures that cause agony while genuinely seeing himself as a dedicated scientist engaged in important research. This is not psychopathy, not an inability to feel empathy. Mengele is capable of affection and normal social bonding in certain contexts. But he's learned to suppress empathy selectively, to turn it off when it would interfere with his ambitions, to wall off certain categories of people as not deserving of moral consideration. This selective empathy is actually more dangerous than complete absence of empathy, because it allows someone to maintain a self-image as a normal, moral person, even while committing atrocities. The third element is ideological armor, the adoption of a belief system that provides moral justification for actions that would otherwise trigger guilt. The Nazi racial ideology functions for Mengele not as corruption, but as liberation from constraints he has come to see as outdated sentiment. The ideology tells him that his experimental subjects are not really fully human, that their lives have less value, that using them for research is justified because it contributes to the improvement of the superior race. Josef Mengele at this moment is all of these things simultaneously. A brilliant scientist with genuine intellectual gifts, a narcissist whose identity depends on being exceptional, a compartmentalized mind capable of suppressing empathy, and an ideologue who has found the perfect justification for pursuing research without ethical constraints. And now, all that is needed is opportunity, and that opportunity is about to present itself in the most terrible form imaginable. On May 30th, 1943, Dr. Josef Mengele arrives at Auschwitz-Birkenau to take up his post as camp physician. He has been assigned here after being wounded on the Eastern Front, where he was decorated for pulling wounded soldiers from a burning tank under fire. The wound was not severe, but it made him ineligible for further combat duty. But Auschwitz-Birkenau is not simply a concentration camp. It has evolved into something unprecedented in human history, a vast industrial complex designed for mass murder, where human beings arrive by the trainload and are processed with bureaucratic efficiency into categories of immediate death or temporary exploitation. And Josef Mengele, arriving with his medical degree and his research ambitions, looks at Auschwitz and sees something different. He sees the largest human research laboratory in history, an unprecedented opportunity to pursue questions that would be impossible to investigate under normal ethical constraints. He sees thousands of human subjects arriving daily, a population completely under his control, with no ethical oversight, no requirement to obtain informed consent, no limitations on what procedures can be performed. This is the moment when the psychological elements that have been forming in Mengele for 3 decades find the environmental circumstances that allow them to express fully. His need to be exceptional now has the opportunity to pursue research on a scale that no other scientist in history has had access to. His capacity for compartmentalization allows him to see his subjects as data points rather than as suffering individuals. His ideological framework tells him that what he is doing is not only permissible, but important. One of the first things that marks Josef Mengele as different from other camp physicians is that he volunteers for selection duty on the arrival ramp, where trains arrive, and SS doctors determine who will be sent immediately to the gas chambers and who will be assigned to work. This is unusual behaviour because selection duty is exhausting work that most camp physicians rotate through reluctantly. Most camp physicians find this duty disturbing, find it difficult to maintain psychological detachment. They drink heavily, they request transfers, they rotate the duty to limit exposure. But Josef Mengele not only accepts selection duty without complaint, but actively requests it, volunteering for extra shifts, making himself available whenever trains are arriving. Survivors describe his appearance with consistency. He is always impeccably dressed in a pristine SS uniform, white gloves on his hands, boots polished to a high shine, carrying a riding crop or baton that he uses to gesture right or left as prisoners file past him. Some describe him whistling classical music while he works. There is a theatrical quality to his presence, a sense that this is not merely someone performing an unpleasant duty, but someone who has found a role that allows him to demonstrate his command, his authority, his ability to remain composed while making life and death decisions with a casual flick of his wrist. But there is another reason why Mengele volunteers so enthusiastically for selection duty. The selection process gives him first access to new arrivals, and he is searching for something very specific among the thousands of faces that pass before him. He is looking for twins. The fascination with twins grows out of fundamental questions in genetics about the relative contributions of heredity and environment to human traits, about how to separate what is inborn from what is learned. Twins, particularly identical twins who share genetic material but may have different experiences, offer what appears to be the perfect natural experiment. In normal scientific research, twin studies are conducted through careful observation, statistical analysis, always with informed consent and ethical oversight. The limitations of ethical research mean that questions remain unanswered, that certain comparisons cannot be made. But Josef Mengele at Auschwitz is not constrained by normal ethical limitations, and he recognizes that he has access to something unprecedented, an essentially unlimited population of twins over whom he has complete control, whom he can subject to any procedure, whose bodies he can examine in life and in death without any concern for their suffering or survival. And so, he searches the arriving trains with intense focus, calling out when he spots twins, pulling them from the selection line before they can be sent to immediate death. Survivors remember his excitement when he found twins, the way he would speak to them with apparent kindness, promising they would be well treated. And in a horrific way, this was partly true. Twins were not sent to the gas chambers, were given better food, were housed together in special barracks, were allowed to keep their clothing and hair. But this apparent kindness was not mercy, but rather the care that a researcher extends to valuable experimental subjects. The twins were kept alive and relatively healthy because Mengele needed them alive for his experiments. The kindness was instrumental, a means to an end, as cold and calculated as every other aspect of his work. What exactly Josef Mengele did to the twins and other prisoners is documented through survivor testimonies, medical records, and fragments of his research notes. He conducted comparative studies on twins, subjecting them to identical procedures and documenting differences in their responses. He would inject twins with various substances, including pathogens, to see if their immune responses were identical. He performed surgical procedures without anesthesia on some subjects while providing it to their twins, measuring differences in recovery rates. He was particularly interested in eye color, attempting to change brown eyes to blue through injection of chemicals into the iris. The children who survived these experiments reported excruciating pain, and many suffered permanent blindness. He conducted studies on growth and development, measuring every aspect of twins' bodies. He was interested in hereditary diseases and abnormalities, examining subjects extensively, and then, in many cases, killing them so he could conduct post-mortem examinations and preserve their organs for his collection of specimens. Prisoner doctors, forced to assist Mengele, described how he would become animated when discussing his research findings, enthusiastic about data, frustrated when results were unclear. He behaved exactly like a dedicated scientist engaged in important research, except that his research subjects were children and prisoners who had not consented, who were suffering and dying for the sake of his curiosity. The psychological mechanisms that allowed Mengele to conduct these procedures without apparent distress are the same mechanisms of moral disengagement we identified earlier. The euphemistic language of medical research allowed him to avoid confronting the reality that he was torturing people. When he wrote about subjects and specimens and experimental interventions, he was using words that created psychological distance. The bureaucratic routines created a sense of normalcy that masked the grotesque abnormality of what he was doing. Josef Mengele was not a unique monster. He was frighteningly normal in most respects. Intelligent, educated, capable of charm and normal social functioning. What made him capable of committing atrocities was not the presence of something extraordinary, but rather the absence of something ordinary, the absence of robust moral constraints that could resist ideological pressure, the absence of empathy that extended beyond his immediate circle. The psychological mechanisms that allowed Mengele to conduct his experiments while maintaining a self-image as a good person are not unique to him or to Nazi Germany. They are general features of human psychology that can be activated under the right conditions. The capacity for compartmentalization, for moral disengagement, for selective empathy, for self-serving rationalization exists in all of us, waiting to be activated when ideology and circumstance align. What protected most people from becoming like Mengele was not superior moral character, but rather the absence of the specific combination of factors that converged in his case. Mengele's crimes required not just his particular psychology, but also a system that gave him opportunity and authority and ideological justification, that removed normal constraints and provided institutional support for atrocity. The lesson of Josef Mengele is not that monsters walk among us, but rather that any of us, under the right circumstances, could find ourselves travelling down the path he travelled. The transformation from healer to killer is not a supernatural event, but a psychological process that we can identify and study and work to prevent. When we see dehumanizing rhetoric that categorizes groups as inferior, when we see institutions that remove ethical oversight, when we see ideologies that justify extraordinary means in pursuit of noble ends, when we see people whose identity depends on achievement being given unchecked power over vulnerable populations, we are seeing the preconditions for atrocity. The angel of death was not born a monster. He was made, step by step, choice by choice, rationalization by rationalization, through a process that we can understand and therefore can work to prevent. The distance between healer and killer is not as great as we would like to believe, and maintaining that distance requires constant vigilance, constant moral attention, constant refusal to accept the ideologies that promise to liberate us from ethical constraint. Josef Mengele died in 1979. But the psychological and social mechanisms that created him remain active in our world. Understanding his case is not merely historical analysis, but a continuing obligation to recognize and resist the patterns that could produce similar horrors in our own time. This has been Forgotten Minds. Remember that understanding evil is the first step toward preventing it. Until next time, stay vigilant.